All right, what's up, everybody? We're going to do a quick review of chapter 12 of the autobiography of Malcolm X as told to Alex Haley. Title of chapter 12 is Savior. In the spring of 1952, Malcolm is about 27 years old. Malcolm's told that he will be released from prison. He was going to be released to the custody of his older brother, Wilfred, in Detroit. Malcolm started working at a furniture store. His brother Wilfred was the manager of the furniture store. Malcolm came to Detroit. He says he came to Detroit for family. He was previously in Boston while he was in prison. Malcolm was released from prison in August 1952. Malcolm's first stop out of prison was a Turkish bath. He says he wanted to get the prison feeling off of him. It talks about Ella resisting becoming Muslim. He says the first things that he bought once he got out of prison were glasses, a suitcase, and a wristwatch. Malcolm says, quote, "Without knowing it, I was preparing for what my life was about to become," end quote. Malcolm says that those are the three things I have used more than anything else. He says, quote, "I drive by my watch, not by my speedometer. Time is more important to me than distance," end quote. The furniture store that Wilfred managed was in the ghetto of Detroit. Malcolm was working as per the agreement of his release. Malcolm noticed that the economy was built on exploitation. He talks about financing, and he says that the money was going to exclusive areas. So you're financing from the poor people, and then that money, the extra money is going to the rich people that can afford to finance others. As the man of the house, Wilfred, his older brother, was the first to wake up at his home. Malcolm says, quote, "The father prepares the way for his family," end quote. Wilfred taught Malcolm how to be he was the first one to teach Malcolm how Muslims behaved out of prison. They didn't have any solids for breakfast. They only drank coffee or juice. They talked about Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday were days of meeting in the temple. Temple number 1 was originally a storefront. Malcolm says, quote, the first temple to be formed back in 1931 by Master W.D. Fard was formed in Detroit, Michigan, end quote. He says, quote, "Never seen Christian believing Negroes conduct themselves like Muslims, the individuals and the families alike," end quote. Lemuel Hassan was a minister at Temple number 1. Minister Lemuel lectured about Elijah Muhammad's teachings. Malcolm felt that there should be no empty seats with the streets full of brainwashed brothers and sisters. The recruitment attitude of the Muslims at Temple number 1 was that, quote, Allah would bring more Muslims, end quote. Malcolm says, quote, "I thought we should go into the streets and get more Muslims into the fold," end quote. His older brother Wilfred told Malcolm to be patient. Malcolm stayed patient by dreaming of meeting Elijah Muhammad. He says, quote, "He looked forward to the Sunday before Labor Day in 1952 with an eagerness never duplicated," end quote. That day would be August 25th, 1952. Malcolm visited Temple number 2 in Chicago. For the trip to Chicago, Malcolm says he was excited like a child. He said they traveled in Wilfred's car. At the time, it's 1952. He said the two temples had only 200 people between Detroit and Chicago. They were driving from Detroit. It would be about 10 cars in the caravan to Chicago. Malcolm says, quote, "I was totally unprepared for the messenger Elijah Muhammad's physical impact upon my emotions," end quote. Elijah Muhammad spoke of how, quote, how the blue-eyed devil, white men, had brainwashed so-called Negroes, end quote. Malcolm continued, quote, "He told us and showed us how his teachings of the true knowledge of ourselves would lift up the black man from the bottom of the white man's society and place the black man where he had begun, at the top of civilization, end quote. At the end of the lecture, Elijah Muhammad called Malcolm's name and he was asked to stand. Malcolm says, quote, "It was like an electric shock." Elijah Muhammad told the audience how Malcolm had just got out of prison and how he wrote to him daily. Elijah Muhammad referred to Malcolm as a parable of how the devil told God to remove the hedge, the protection from Job, and he will curse you to your face. Elijah was saying that out of prison, Malcolm could return to drinking, smoking, and crime now that his hedge of the prison had been removed. Malcolm says, quote, "I told him at the beginning of the crisis with all sincerity I had in him that I still believed in him more strongly than he believed in himself," end quote. Regarding their split, Malcolm says, quote, "Muhammad and I are not together today only because of envy and jealousy," end quote. Malcolm says he has more faith in Elijah Muhammad than any other man on earth. Malcolm was invited to Elijah Muhammad's 18-room home in Chicago. At the dinner, Malcolm talked about the Detroit Mosque's recruiting strategy and waiting for Allah to bring members. Malcolm says, quote, "There at Muhammad's table, I found my tongue. I've always been one to speak my mind," end quote. Malcolm spoke to Elijah Muhammad about recruiting young people in Detroit. He started fishing in the streets of Detroit. He says, quote, "I knew the thinking and the language of the ghetto streets," end quote. This is when Malcolm received his X from Chicago. He says the Muslim's X symbolized the true African name that he could never know. Malcolm says, quote, "Mr. Muhammad taught that we would keep the X until God himself returned and gave us a holy name from his mouth," end quote. Malcolm recruited in the streets of Detroit. He says, quote, "I found my poor, ignorant, brainwashed black brothers mostly too deaf, dumb, and blind mentally, morally, and spiritually to respond," end quote. He was angered that people weren't curious about the teachings that would resurrect the black man. Not many people would show up for the meetings. He says, quote, "Even after seeing and hearing Elijah Muhammad in person, only a few of the visitors would apply by formal letter to Mr. Muhammad to be accepted for the Nation of Islam membership," end quote. Within a few months, they tripled the membership of Temple Number 1. The caravans to Chicago grew to 25 cars. Malcolm says, quote, he worshipped him, speaking of Elijah Muhammad. In 1953, Malcolm's late 27, early 28 years old, Malcolm left the furniture store and started working at the Garwood factory in Detroit. Malcolm talked about having more temples in other cities. He felt like they should be reaching more people. Malcolm never thought he would become a minister. Some of his first words as a speaker were, quote, "If I told you the life I lived, you would find it hard to believe me. When I say something about the white man, I'm not talking about someone I don't know," end quote. When Malcolm began to speak, he preferred the subject of Christianity. This is something that he felt he was well equipped with from reading in prison. He said Christianity taught him how the black people were here in the wilderness of North America. He says, quote, "This white man's Christian religion used to brainwash us black people," end quote. And he talks about pie in the sky, heaven after death. Talking in front of 75 to 100 Muslims, Malcolm says, prepared him to speak to millions through speeches, radio, and television. In the summer of 1953, Malcolm be 28 years old, Malcolm was named minister of Temple Number 1. Malcolm would recruit every night. He would still get angry when people wouldn't hear his message. He says, quote, "My head would reel sometimes with mingled anger and pity for my poor black brothers," end quote. The next time the minister let Malcolm speak is when he talked about Plymouth Rock. He says, quote, "We didn't land on Plymouth Rock, my brothers and sisters. Plymouth Rock landed on us," end quote. Malcolm told people about his Detroit Red days and how his grandfather was white. He says, quote, "I hate every drop of the rapist's blood in me," end quote. Malcolm felt that all blacks were victims in some form of rape. He says, quote, even today the black man lives with fear of the white man in his heart, end quote. He continues, quote, if you and me polluted all these colors and this devil, no, hold on. You and me polluted all these colors and this devil has the arrogance and gall to think we, his victims, should love him, end quote. Malcolm would walk the streets late at night. He says, quote, thinking to myself about what the white man had done to our poor people here in America, end quote. He briefly talks about being drafted for the Korean War. Malcolm spoke so much at Temple number 1, he said that his voice was always hoarse. He says, quote, do you know what the white man do you know why the white man really hates you? It's because every time he sees your face, he sees a mirror of his crime and his guilty conscience can't bear to face it, end quote. Malcolm leaves the Gar Wood factory and started working for Ford Motor Company in 1953. Malcolm went to Chicago as much as he could. He says, quote, as a young minister, I would go to Chicago and see Mr. Elijah Muhammad every time I could get off, end quote. Malcolm was treated like he was one of the sons of Mr. Muhammad. Malcolm spent a lot of time with Mr. Muhammad's mother. He says, quote, I would spend almost as much time with Mother Marie as I did with Mr. Muhammad, end quote. He learned about Elijah's early life in Georgia. Malcolm spent a lot of time traveling with Mr. Muhammad. They visited stores owned by blacks, and Mr. Muhammad would sweep the floors. Malcolm says, quote, Mr. Muhammad would do such work himself as an example to his followers, whom he taught that let's see this again. Malcolm says, quote, Mr. Muhammad would do such work himself, and he's talking about sweeping floors. He would do such work himself as an example to his followers, whom he taught that idleness and laziness were among the black man's greatest sins against himself, end quote. Malcolm says he wanted to sweep for Mr. Muhammad. Malcolm looked to Elijah Muhammad like Socrates or Aristotle, how they gave wisdom to their students. This is when Elijah Muhammad tells the story about the dirty glass of water compared to the clean water. Mr. Muhammad says, quote, don't condemn if you see a person has a dirty glass of water. Just show them the clean glass of water you have. When they inspect it, you don't have to say that yours is better, end quote. Mr. Muhammad told Malcolm about having Mr. Muhammad's mother told Malcolm about having a vision at 7 years old that she would be the mother of a great man. She had 13 children, including Elijah. Elijah had to quit school after the 4th grade to help his family. Elijah would read the Bible a lot, and he would get frustrated trying to unlock the Bible. Elijah wasn't ashamed of his lack of formal school. He says, quote, my going to school no further than the 4th grade proves that I can know nothing except the truth I have been taught by Allah, end quote. Regarding the way Mr. Muhammad spoke, Malcolm says, quote, he was not as eloquent as eloquence is usually meant, but whatever he uttered had an impact on me trained orators did not begin to have, end quote. Elijah Muhammad moved from Georgia to Detroit in 1923. He was 25 and had 7 children at the time. Malcolm says, quote, in Detroit in 1931, Mr. Muhammad met W.D. Fard, end quote. He talked about how Fard sold silks and yard goods. And during the meetings, Fard would teach about both the Quran and the Bible. Elijah was a student of W.D. Fard. Malcolm says, quote, in essence, Mr. W.D. Fard taught that God's true name was Allah, that his true religion was Islam, and that the true name of that religion's people was Muslims, end quote. W.D. Fard said that Negroes in America were Muslims and lost sheep of the Nation of Islam. He taught that heaven and hell were here on earth. W.D. Fard was to bring the black man home. Fard taught that the white man was bred from the black man to create hell for 6,000 years. He taught that the black people were gods themselves. Mr. Muhammad says, quote, he had a revelation that Master W.D. Fard represented the fulfillment of the prophecy, end quote. W.D. Fard says, quote, my name is Mahdi. I came to guide you to the right path, end quote. Elijah Muhammad named Elijah Poole Elijah Kareem. In 1931, in Detroit, Master W.D. Fard established a University of Islam to teach Negroes and to keep them from being deceived by the, quote, blue-eyed devil white man, end quote. The Nation of Islam lacked qualified teachers, but wanted to start somewhere. Elijah Kareem and his children became the nucleus or main group of the school. W.D. Fard selected Elijah Kareem as supreme minister. Elijah talks about the jealousy from other students. The other students felt they were more educated and articulate than Elijah. The students believed, quote, why should we bow down to someone who appears less qualified, end quote. Elijah Kareem is eventually renamed Elijah Muhammad. He was the supreme minister. He received private teachings from Master W.D. Fard. Malcolm says Elijah, quote, heard things never revealed to others, end quote. This is when Elijah Muhammad and W.D. Fard established Temple Number 2 in Chicago. Milwaukee became Temple Number 3. Master W.D. Fard disappeared in 1934 without a trace. Jealous ministers in Detroit forced Elijah to flee to Chicago. Mr. Muhammad fled from city to city to avoid the quote-unquote hypocrites. The hypocrites were trying to kill Mr. Muhammad. Mr. Muhammad is arrested in 1942 for draft dodging, although he is too old for military service. At the time, he's about 45 years old. He was sentenced to 5 years in Milan, Michigan. He was paroled after 3.5 years. Elijah Muhammad returned to his work in 1946. Malcolm says, quote, the devil white man does not want the Honorable Elijah Muhammad stirring away the sleeping giant of you and me, and of all our ignorant, brainwashed kind here in the white man's heaven and the black man's hell in this wilderness of North America, end quote. Malcolm says, quote, I have pledged on my knees to Allah to tell the white man about his crimes and the black man the true teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. I don't care if it costs my life, end quote. Malcolm was Elijah's most faithful servant. He believed in Elijah more than he believed in himself. Malcolm ends the chapter foreshadowing a psychological and spiritual crisis in years to come. And that is the end of chapter 12. And make sure you share this video if you like what you heard. Put in the comments if you disagree with anything I said. Make sure you read the book yourself. And visit MalcolmXFoundation.org if you'd like to make a donation to his family. Other than that, I'll see y'all in chapter 13. Thank you.